Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to this centenary event. We're coming towards the end of the KSA centenary, 100 years of the association, the alumni of Kitchener Scholars. So I think it's really fitting that we get this opportunity to think in more depth and consider the man who has brought us together. We're not benefactors. He wasn't our benefactor as such, but we are all brought together in the name of Lord Kitchener. So it would be so interesting to find out more about him. I'm incredibly grateful to Keith and to Anne and to Charles, our Vice Chair, for setting up this panel. It's going to be fascinating. I'm particularly interested to learn more about how Kitchener responded to the politicians of his day. I have been thinking about what he might have thought of our own politicians, particularly at the moment. So there's so much to learn. I've had a bit of a sneak preview, but I'm so grateful to our panel here and to Charles for moderating. So without further ado, I will hand over to Charles.
Okay, well, good evening. And just to point out, apart from the people in the room, we have people on Zoom, and we're going to record this for posterity as well. So I'm very much looking forward to this session. I'll just start with a bit of housekeeping, if I might. It won't interest the people on Zoom. The door over there is the key to everything. To the left are the loos, there's a cloakroom, and in the unlikely event of some sort of incident, there's a fire escape, will be out there, i.e. through those doors, turn right. Okay, so that's the health and safety aspect. So as we said to you, we're talking today, of course, about the first Lord Kitchener of Khartoum, Horatio Herbert Kitchener. What can we learn today from the life and exploits of Lord Kitchener? That's really our theme. We want to make it contemporary as well as historical. So we will be talking history, but I think it's always valuable to know what it means for us. For many of us, the life he lived and the time he lived is so distant when you think about it. It's incredible. But on the other hand, there are some lessons to be extracted. Unfortunately, Rodney Attwood couldn't make it tonight. He said he would come, but he had something else. But he wrote an article which is available, and I'm going to put it on the website. He wrote an article about Lord Kitchener, a sort of summary article, which is full of pictures and stuff. And he called it, its title was A Man for All Seasons or a Soldier of His Time. Well, of course, both are true. And we want to know, in the sense of the man for all seasons, what can we take out of his life and his exploits and the example he set, which might have relevance to us in our own lives at this very remote distance from the events we're talking about. And then, of course, a soldier of his time. A lot of context will be discussed tonight. He lived at a certain time in his own context. We will, of course, be covering those aspects. So, pause for reflection. I think what we'd like to do is make this as interactive as possible. So don't feel reluctant to put your hand up. I will moderate the session. You can ask questions, pick up the point. If the speakers feel that it's a subject which we're going to come back to anyway, we'll sort of let you know, but just feel free to jump in and ask questions, and we'll have a very interactive discussion. Participation is extremely welcome. But first of all, let me introduce our speakers. So in the middle here is Dr. Anne Sampson, who has written a recent book, which actually she's got in front of her. I'm sure she will hold up. She is an independent historian and the author of the most recent biography of Kitchener. There have been many biographies of Kitchener, most of which are on the website already. But this book, Kitchener, the Man, Not the Myth, 2019, is Anne's work. She's really tried to get a feel for the man himself. She's written numerous articles on the wars in Africa. She is of South African heritage and now lives in the UK. Dr. Keith Surridge is Associate Professor at the University of Notre Dame here in London. There are campuses of US universities in London, and Keith actually works for more than one of them. He's an in-demand resource, particularly, of course, specifically in history. He's published 2 books and many articles on the South African War and on Victorian military history. And he's written a nice chapter in a book called Victoria's Generals. And indeed is currently working on a book about Omdurman and the Sudanese campaign. So you've got here some real expertise on the man. Most of the biographers, the famous biographers, have passed away. And we will be talking about some of those biographies. They themselves, of course, acquire historical significance. You know, that it's always the thing about a book written about history or biography is that it tells you as much about the person writing it as it does about the person that's the subject of the work. And I think it's very true of these biographies of Kitchener, which we'll come back to. So with our format for tonight is we're going to break it into some sections, as you would expect. We're going to talk first. Anne is going to talk a sort of introductory session, a little overview of Kitchener, just to give you the flavour of who we're talking about, particularly his early life, his background, and and then right through to where he really started his military career. I mean, there was quite a few years, by the way, in his 20s where he was in the army, but he wasn't specifically campaigning. And then Keith's got a sort of heavy lifting role tonight. He's going to talk about the 4 major theatres in which Kitchener was active, namely the Egyptian/Sudanese area, where he occupied a large part of his life, the South African War, where he became commander-in-chief. He was also commander-in-chief in India, so that he switched over there. There were some other episodes as well. And then, of course, he became Secretary of State for War in the First World War and sadly passed away in 1916. We'll come back to that. So Keith's job is to take us through that military period and will not be slow to come forward and give some views on that part of the segment. And then we will then move into a session where we'll be more assessing the man and the relevance and the conclusions of our work. We thought we'd go for about an hour and then have a kind of comfort break. The bar will remain obstinately closed during that comfort break. But afterwards, when it's over, we'll have a second hour, and then at 8:30 roughly, we'll have some time for some more drinks, food, and chat and networking, and you can talk to our experts in more detail. So that's really enough from me. So I know, Anne, you want to start us off with a few questions when you set the scene. So off you go, please.
You can either ask questions, but thankfully there are no tomatoes here. Because if I was giving this talk in South Africa, I would be expecting the rotten tomatoes to be thrown and pelted at me, given the topic of Kitchener. His name is not very well received still in my home country. So before I tell you why I have written about this very good-looking man, sorry, other good-looking man in the room, my husband is here tonight as well to support us, who has had to live Kitchener as well. I think this is one of the other things, I don't know about your partner, but they're really supportive in terms of having to deal with our obsessions of historical characters and other love affairs, I could say. But yes, so Kitchener is a man who I've got to know quite well for various reasons, and we'll look at those a bit as well. But before I do so, I want to know from you, how many of you know anything about Kitchener other than him being in the title of the Kitchener Scholars Association? Just, you don't have to answer questions at this point, just put up a hand, right?
It's one of the questions on the interview panel, so everybody knows them.
A little bit, okay. So then the next question is, and this one requires an answer or two. Why are you here tonight? Apart from the networking
And the drink.
and the, well, that's part of the networking, isn't it? It's the euphemism for networking. Give me some ideas of why you're here. What are you wanting to find out tonight that you've come along for?
Need to get more context, really, because we are all Kitchener scholars. We all say the name, we'll say the word endlessly, endlessly getting emails with Kitchener in the title, or Mike is writing them. But actually to drill into the person and the achievements of that person, that's something we have the opportunity to do.
All right, yeah, excellent. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Perhaps in a short way, why your countrymen throw tomatoes at you.
I think you'll be touching on that one.
Bit on that.
Yeah. We'll leave that one to Keith. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. There was another hand, yes, sir, at the back. Oh, but,
Find out a bit more about the man.
right, just in
Some
general.
of the stories in the past, their views seem to be somewhat biased against him. Be interesting to get a more balanced view and to learn more about him.
I shall definitely answer that one for you. Thank you. Yep.
And also there is life before your country needs you. We all associate in this country with that poster, but obviously he didn't suddenly appear in that illustrious role. He must have had a back story, and I think that's
Yeah.
the moment.
Right, thank you. I think we'll be touching on that too.
I'm interested in his views on the relationship with the French.
Ah, interesting one, yes. I think we'll be touching on that. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah.
I would like to have a good reason to explain to people when I'm going to a Kitchener Scholars Association event to kind of say why he's a relevant person that we should kind of still be thinking about, and sum up in a few lines kind of what his legacy is, and no more than the 5 minutes mucking up I did before.
Right, yeah. Good one, yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, I'll start with that one, answering your question in a short way, and then go into some of the background. He was a man of peace. I'm going to let you mull over that for a bit. But that is what attracted me to Kitchener, was I discovered that he actually strove for peace despite being a military general, which is not what you expect from military generals, I don't think. Well, I didn't. And Keith's going to go into it quite a bit in terms of how he operated as a military man. But I'm a First World War Africa specialist. That was the bit you left out, was the Africa bit. So very, very niche. And it was in looking at some of that and trying to understand why East Africa, today's Kenya, Tanzania, got involved in the First World War, that I found a note by Kitchener saying he didn't want to go to war in East Africa. That would all be sorted out at the peace table based on who won in Europe. And in fact, he asked to be an attendee at the Paris Peace Conference before he knew it was going to be the Paris Peace Conference, and before he died, because he wanted to be involved in how the peace worked out. And I thought this was really interesting. And having grown up in South Africa with the reputation that Kitchener had, I thought, or made the massive assumption, it was because he owned a coffee farm in Kenya. So he didn't want to go to war in 1914-15 in East Africa because he was protecting his coffee farm. And I think the image we have of Kitchener today, you can well imagine him taking that kind of personal approach, protect his own good. But a few years later, I did some more discovery and found another letter where he actually wrote to Smith Dorrien, who was to take over, and you'll be touching on Smith Dorrien, I imagine, in various ways.
Yeah.
His name will pop up somewhere along the way. If not, I'll have some of it too. He was to become commander-in-chief in East Africa. And Kitchener wrote to him and said to him, I had absolutely nothing to do with your appointment. I do not approve of the war being relaunched in East Africa. You need to go and speak to Prime Minister Asquith, who made this decision. And I'm not supplying any equipment to the campaign either. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And it materialized that Kitchener was out in the Dardanelles at the time. So the War Cabinet actually got rid of him to go and investigate elsewhere. And I think you'll be touching on that bit too.
A bit,
Yeah,
yeah.
a bit, yeah. So that they could make a decision to not have peace in East Africa, but to launch the campaign again. And there are other things that through investigation I discovered that for me, Kitchener is a man of peace. And in working through that, discovered a huge amount of other material about the man, which eventually culminated in this book. So I'm going to leave that there before I take any more of your thunder of military
That's
stuff.
fine, that's fine.
And let's look at a bit of who he was and address the question as well of why he's got the reputation he does. And we'll come back to that later on. As Charles has alluded to already, I'm South African. So I regard myself as a colonial. In fact, I regard myself as a dominional. And it's an insider-outsider thing. And Kitchener, I can quite associate with as well. He wasn't born in Britain. He was born in Ireland to English parents. He was born in 1850 in Ballygowan in County Kerry. And he spent his first years there in Ireland, yes, with an English heritage, but out in the Irish countryside, etc. His dad was a very fascinating man. He'd been a soldier. Kitchener came from a line of soldiers. Dad believed in harsh living and training people for all eventualities. In winter, there was no heating, apparently. You kept warm by covering yourself with newspaper. So you can imagine, for me,
Good lessons for today.
good lesson. Here we go. First lesson to take forward, stock up on your newspapers on the metro as you leave tonight. So newspaper was the thing that you used at night to keep warm. As a result of that, Mom fell ill and had to go and get treatment elsewhere, which happened to be in Switzerland. And the family was relocated to Switzerland, where she eventually died. And that introduces another aspect of Kitchener's non-Britishness in that he's been educated then in Europe. And we'll come back to that a little bit more. But back to the family life, he was, we've got a slide of some young Kitchener. Yes.
You said Kitchener's non-British. Surely he was as British as anybody else who was in Scotland Island at that time.
He's a British citizen, but his way of upbringing and that I don't think is quite British as you would expect somebody growing up on the island of
Ireland.
he
was part of
the UK.
Well, he was part of that Protestant
Yeah.
military ascendancy that you found in Ireland, because many of the British officers in the Victorian Army were born in Ireland, and they were Irish, or considered themselves Irish Protestants as well. And
Did they consider themselves not British?
oh, they considered themselves British, but not Irish. Probably a lot of the time. I'm thinking of the Duke of Wellington, who said when someone referred to him as Irish, he said, just because you're born in a stable doesn't mean to say you're a horse. So, and I think that was the army officers in the Protestant ones, and who will cause trouble in 1914, late when Ireland is ready for home rule, because they don't believe that Protestants should be forced into an independent Catholic-dominated Ireland. So there was this class, some of the famous soldiers of the time, weren't they? They were Irish, like Wolseley, I think he was born in Ireland. Roberts was as well.
Extraordinary, actually, the
Yeah.
number of senior
Goths.
British Army officers who were born or raised in Ireland.
Yeah, so
Right through the 19th.
Kitchener might have been, if he hadn't moved out of Ireland early, so soon, he would have been part of that Protestant ascendancy that still existed in Ireland.
I think there's also, dare I paraphrase a popular book title, 50 Shades of Britishness. And there are different gradations of Britishness, depending, I think, on where you are in the empire as well, and how close you are to being in England versus the United Kingdom versus Great Britain.
Are we in danger of looking at Britishness with the spectacles of 2022?
No, absolutely.
I'm sure a great number of people in British Empire service who were born overseas, born in
Absolutely,
born in
and
Africa,
yeah, And I think that a lot of them suffer the same sort of challenges that Kitchener faced. He's one of the prominent ones that brings it to light. So I think it'll become clear as we go through as well.
I think,
Yeah.
and we don't hinge his non-Britishness on where he was born, on the fact he was in
No.
Ireland. It's really the picture of moving to Switzerland. He did not go to an English public school. He was educated privately.
Yeah,
It'd be nice to get
No,
into
We're
some of that.
getting into it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's about the whole and how it's, it becomes packaged. Back into Ireland, before he moves to Switzerland, back to Dad. Dad also believed in the children managing themselves. So if anybody teased, if one sibling teased another, he was one of 5 children, one sister, the oldest was a sister, you had to sort it out yourselves. And there's a wonderful little story of Kitchener having done something to his sister, we don't know what it was, but she ends up having him eagle spread out on the ground with croquet hoops for the day. And Mom wasn't allowed to do anything to rescue her son because he'd annoyed Big Sister and Big Sister was allowed to punish him as she felt appropriate. And so this, I think, builds up a resilience in the man and all the Kitchener children having to deal with this kind of lifestyle. It's quite a non-traditional lifestyle, I think, when you put the newspapers and the croquet hoops together, etc. Apparently, also at this point, he was an incredibly good swimmer. And that is significant for events in 1916, which I think very few biographers have actually touched on. There are 55 odd biographies on the man, most of them written in between 1916 and 1930, with a few smatterings afterwards. I think the last one before I did was 1990. Dates are not important, but it was about 1990s, I think.
Some biographies were written while he was still alive,
yeah,
as well, weren't they?
yeah. So there are, and there's one by the Maharajina, written in 1916, just after he had died, because of the friendship that he'd had with her. Anyway, so Mom is very ill and the family has moved across to Switzerland, where he moves from private education into school education. And the children suffer quite significantly there because they discover that the governess who'd been teaching them hadn't actually known much. And so they have to catch up with the school curriculum there. At the same time, he's also, because of being in Switzerland, learning French and German because of where he is. So we're starting to see this development of a multilingual man coming through, and that develops on as well. His mother dies soon after they arrive there, and Dad marries the governess, who is from New Zealand, I think it is, and that causes quite an issue within the family. They don't really like the new mum, but respect Dad for what he's done. So Kitchener decides he's going to go into the military, following in Dad's footsteps, and he comes to England for the first time at the age of 17 to go to Woolwich to do his military training. And he has chosen Woolwich. His other option, given the family history, is to go into the cavalry. And he purposefully chooses not to go into the cavalry because for that you have to own your own horse and you have to have enough money to look after your horse, etc. And he feels he doesn't have that. The next best option is Woolwich and to become a Royal Engineer. And this is one of the areas that cause friction later on and where I think some of the biases come in. Because he does join the cavalry. He becomes an Egyptian cavalry officer and trains the Egyptian cavalry. And a lot of biographers actually claim he knew nothing about horsemanship. In fact, he used to train his own horses and won a number of races in Cyprus and in Egypt and India, I think. He had a horse injury in India, sorry, that caused him to walk with a limp because it hadn't been properly set. So a multifaceted man that's starting to come through. At Woolwich, he specializes in photography and also in surveying. And so his first job is to go to Palestine. But before he gets to Palestine, before he's commissioned, we have the Franco-Prussian War happening over in Europe. And between finishing his studies and being commissioned, Dad says to him, come on holiday over, because Dad is now still in Europe. Come along, and I've organized a position for you in the Franco-Prussian War. So Kitchener goes along with a mate of his, and there's a bit of grey area of exactly what he does. But he ends up being an ambulance driver at some point, but also up in a hot air balloon. Hot air balloons were used at that time for surveying and for seeing what was happening on the enemy side, intelligence type stuff. So he's one of the first British soldiers, as far as I know, to go up in a hot air balloon and to see the benefits of this. He supposedly contracts pneumonia in this process and ends up having to come to Britain ill. At which point his commission has also come through. So he is technically a British officer fighting in a foreign war illegally. And you can imagine the foreign implications of this international incident. The Duke, Cambridge, it is Cambridge. There's so many dukes in that, and I don't work on these things. Takes him to task no end about having done this, and says, your army career could pretty much be over by now because of this. Don't do it again. And then as Kitchener is leaving, he sort of says to him, I would have done the same thing myself. And I think that is a very valuable lesson for Kitchener. And I see that coming through later on in some of the stuff Keith is going to talk about, where farm burning happens in South Africa, and a young man refuses to burn a farm and is supposed to be court-martialed, and Kitchener lets him off because he's not taken to task in the public domain. So he doesn't have to be shown an example of. And you see this on other occasions as well, where Kitchener has a very, if something's in the public domain and an example needs to be set, he will do that, and he will be harsh, and punishment will be harsh, but fair. I think that's also very important. But at the same time, he understands the humanity of people and, energies and excitement and wanting to try new things. And he takes that into account as well. So, and he understands the ethics and the ethos behind certain decisions too. And he judges and gauges his decisions based on that, in my opinion. So his first job, once he's not been decommissioned, having just been appointed, is to go to Palestine to map what was then the Holy Land. And to do that, he teams up with the leader of the group called Henry Conda, and they learn Hebrew together. So we now have another language coming in. And Kitchener spends about 4 years in Palestine mapping the Holy Land. Palestine is the whole of what is Israel today, Israel, Palestine, Iraq, that whole sort of area, Middle East area. He apparently is incredibly thorough, going on with his the family logo motto, and he identifies 400 new places in the area for maps. He also corrects spelling. He gets very ingenious ways of making sure that they get the correct spellings of places, and he organizes the correct locations. And I was astounded. This man knew his Bible, his Christian Bible, because one of the reports that he writes, he is standing somewhere and he says that based on where he's standing, looking that way and taking that into account, over the 3 miles, whatever, ahead, that's where the wall of Jericho was. Which, the story goes that they marched around the walls of Jericho 7 times and they fell down. Well, he identifies with his knowledge and mapping skills and the layout of the land where the walls of Jericho, for example, were. Amazing detail. At the same time, he's taking photographs, and he publishes his photographs in Blackwell's magazine to earn him some money as well. And some incredible photographs, if you can get to see those versions.
And I think there was a military purpose here, because Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
And of course, Egypt was in contention, and it would not have been beyond the wit of man that we would potentially go to war with the other. So all of this stuff was laying the foundation for, this was real Royal Engineers.
Yeah.
Deep research, which would later potentially provide the British with
Yeah.
intelligence.
And also part of the colonial outreach, because eventually after the First World War, Britain and France divide that whole area between themselves. And so having the knowledge of what is there is very important. And my understanding is that the maps that we have of the Middle East today are still based on the original maps that Kitchener put together. That is how accurate they were. So quite something.
It's all in his 20s.
In his 20s, yeah. 1870s, yeah. While he's out there, he's living with the Bedouin, and this is another important part, and learns Arabic. And he is busy mediating between the Christians who are in Arabia, the Middle East area, with the Ottomans and the raiding, etc. And he's working, trying to find ways to keep them peaceful, because if they're not peaceful, they can't, the Royal Engineers can't do theirs. And he does end up being injured out there and having to come back and be recuperate. Kondo doesn't go back after an injury he'd had, but Kitchener, on going back, he tracks down the men who had injured him and has a token fine issued against them so that they know that he's the boss, but also so that he doesn't alienate them in terms of working forward again. From there, having done some amazing work, he then goes on to Cyprus, where he tries to do the same thing, and it doesn't quite work because his aim is to be as thorough as what he was in Palestine. Oh, and by the way, the Palestinian Exploration Fund is still going in different ways today, managed from the British Museum. And this was what he'd gone under the auspices of. He goes to Cyprus, and here he falls foul of Lord Wolseley, who is just wanting a cursory job done in terms of surveying Cyprus. Kitchener wants to do it absolutely thoroughly. And this relationship with Wolseley will play out later on as well. He's also quite keen at this point to start up a Cypriot army, which Wolseley will not have anything to do with at all. So as far as I can work out, Kitchener is one of the few early British Army officers who is looking to train a local native force. And this doesn't sit well with the British Army view of managing outlying territories, etc. So in order to rescue the situation, Kitchener is taken out of Cyprus and is sent to Anatolia in Turkey to be an ambassador for 9 months. You can see this coming. He learns another language. He learns some Turkish, and he's regarded as an incredibly good administrator. And one of the last things he does in Anatolia is to write a report to the Ottoman Emperor to prove that his Turkish is good enough. And this allows him an understanding of the Islamic way, together with his Arabic. He's got a really good understanding of the Arab way of thinking and how you manage and can bring about change and bring peace in a way. So he goes back from Anatolia to Cyprus. Wolseley, by this point, has been moved to South Africa to take over with the Anglo-Zulu War. And whilst he's in Cyprus, Kitchener orchestrates, and I use that word purposefully, some would say manipulate, creatively, to get to Egypt, where his career then really starts off on a military front. He does get into trouble for how he managed to get to Egypt, and it's a fascinating story, which I won't go into the details of here, but he plays a very clever game in getting himself appointed, and is offered a job with the Egyptian army, which he doesn't really want, because it is not part of the British Army and isn't going to get his career going in the direction that he wants it to. He's told that it's either that or nothing, and he decides, well, he's got no choice, he'll take it. And that is what really sets him up and he makes that role his own. And I'm not going to go into that too much detail because I think you're going to pick
Yeah,
up on
that's right,
that
yeah.
aspect.
So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
is he at this point perceived as a rising star, a man on the make? I mean, we're making him sound like a sort of wonder child, not quite child, it's in his twenties, but is that the perception or is it just with hindsight?
I think there's a bit of hindsight in that. I think he's seen as a bit of a troublemaker. Quite clearly, Wolseley has got no time for him and tells him, just do your job. All you've got to do is what I'm telling you. Kitchener believes that he can do better. And people like Biddulph, who are on the more Foreign Office side as opposed to the military side, understand, they can see where he's coming from and they can see something in him which will satisfy that part of the British Empire need. And so they manage that in a way that works. So by sending him to Anatolia, they're removing him from a potentially devastating position, devastating for both Kitchener and for Wolseley and for the British Empire, moving him out to ease the situation. And then when things are quiet and calm again, putting him back in. And this is a trait, Kitchener ends up having some really, really good mentors, or mentors are not quite the right word, people who support him, understand him and protect him along the way. Lord Salisbury is one,
Yeah.
Cromer is another, and I think you'll be looking at a fair bit of.
Yeah, well, all military officers who wanted to get on in the Victorian Army had to look for someone who would be their patron.
Yeah.
That was essential to be,
Yeah.
to get on.
Yeah.
And,
I think there's an element here, just to pick up on, of frustration. We're talking about someone in their twenties, technically brilliant and very curious and constantly educating himself, and not many of those people would have gone charging after Turkey, or he went all around the place, picking up languages and insights, but feeling frustrated because that's when he needs to, his military career that he really was there for, had to take off.
Yeah.
So this was preparation,
Yeah.
but it was a slightly frustrating, and I don't think he probably was particularly on the top of the pops list
No.
back in London. Mark.
Sorry, I'm really ignorant about this.
You're allowed to
Are you
be.
suggesting, or it's the implication that Turkey, Egypt, Palestine were all partly controlled by Britain anyway? Or was he moving in independently to sovereign states?
He's, when he goes into Anatolia, he's almost like a high commissioner.
is it consul?
It's consul, yeah, the consul. So it's in a, he's representing the British there, but to support British people who are working there, trading, etc. But he gets very involved locally too, because that's the kind of man Kitchener is.
The Ottoman Empire was falling apart, right?
Britain was strategically looking at these.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean,
At the moment that he was there, they weren't part of our empire.
No,
no, the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. Everybody was very worried about it, the Eastern question and all that. The Britain decided to annex Egypt. So that explains what we're going to come on to in a minute. And Palestine was in their sights as well. So this was all part of this slow takeover of the Ottoman Empire. The French were involved in that. Chris,
I was going to say one point that hasn't actually been made is key to it, is the Suez Canal.
yeah,
That's the reason for the key interest in the area, because the Suez Canal, the route to India, India's jewel of the crown, part of the empire.
Yeah.
So once we have that interest in the Suez Canal, there's always an interest in the area around it. And as we've just heard, the Ottoman Empire is on the verge of collapse. So we've got to know what's going on in that area so that we can get the Suez Canal.
So there's no question Kitchener himself, by his own efforts and by being in the right place at the right time, became a real authority on the micro aspects of the Ottoman Empire. I think we ought to now move to Keith and pick up, now we're at, if you like, base camp one of the military career. And Keith, if you'd take us through, I know you've got quite a bit to do now.
Okay.
But we'll have a break, don't worry. So if you can deal with Egypt and Sudan and the Boer War, that's a lot. before
Okay,
we break.
I've got-
That'd be great.
Okay, well, I was just going to say one thing about Royal Engineers and surveying. The British did it everywhere, wherever they could get, you know, something going on like the Palestine Exploration Fund. The Royal Engineer was always very good to do the surveying because that would give them information. Any sort of diplomatic mission to an area that was unknown, for example, in 1809, when the British first met the ruler of Afghanistan, they took Royal Engineers with them to do surveying, and they like to know all the country and everywhere that would be of
We have
interest.
any Royal Engineers in the room. We often do. There's one.
Oh, right,
I knew
yeah.
you would. It's an extraordinary organisation, and if you want in the break to sort of pick that up, I'm sure Mr. Kang will help you there.
Yes, because in was it 1875, I think it was, Disraeli bought the controlling shares in the Suez Canal Company. And so Britain did have a stake in the Suez Canal itself, and had already acknowledged that it was a vital waterway. So they were certainly looking at that area very closely. And Kitchener, when in Egypt in 1882, there was anti-European riots and massacres and everything else, because by that time Egypt was bankrupt and it owed the European powers lots of money, and its government had been forced to surrender control of its economy to particularly the British and the French, and the Egyptian people and army didn't like it. And so in 1882 there was this revolt. And the British and the French were going to go in together, but I think there was issues in France. So the British went in on their own and basically took over the country. And Kitchener got himself involved, didn't he? Did he go? I can't remember now if he came from Palestine and crossed Sinai, a reverse Moses, if you like. He certainly did it. He did it before Lawrence, and he probably did it better than Lawrence as well. It caused problems with his eyesight afterwards because of the sun and whatever, but he got himself involved. He wanted to get involved in Egypt because that was another thing for an aspiring army officer. You get involved in some conflict and hopefully get promoted. And he didn't do too much in 1882, but it was after that in 1883 when the British decided to reform the Egyptian army, and they hired, well, Sirdar of the Egyptian army was Sir Henry Evelyn Wood, and he hired British army officers to come and reform the army. And I think possibly for Kitchener, he wanted to do it because I think he refused the first offer because he wanted to appeal to his boss. And then the second offer came and his boss thought, oh, well, we ought to have it. And so he got the job as second in command to the Egyptian cavalry. But what also I think possibly
just that word Sirdar.
Sirdar, yeah.
Where does that come from?
Is it Arabic or Turkish? Because the Egyptian army was actually governed by Turkish terms, because Egypt was still or had been nominally part of the Ottoman Empire even though it was independent. But I think also what appealed to Kitchener was that you got more pay in the Egyptian army and you got an increase in rank as well. So Wood was looking for good officers who spoke Arabic, had to know some Turkish as well, and Kitchener fitted the bill completely.
And he learned to ride a horse.
And well, he trained them. Yeah, I think it's Trevor Royal in his biography mentions that Kitchener opened up recruitment to the cavalry, knowing full well that all these Egyptians coming forward possibly either didn't know how to ride properly or couldn't ride at all. So he would stand in the middle with a whip, watching them go round and round as many of them all fell off, and he would get rid of them and everything else. They said he was like a circus ringmaster. You know, and anyway, he found enough good riders, and he did a very good job in training the Egyptian cavalry. And his boss, I can't remember his name, who the commanding officer was, but he was very pleased with Kitchener. And then that's 1883. What the British hadn't really appreciated as well was what was going on in the Egyptian Sudan. There was an Islamic revolt against Egyptian rule, led by Muhammad Ahmed, the Mahdi. And the British only realised too late, once an Egyptian army was massacred there, that they, now in charge of Egypt, were also responsible for the Sudan. And the British did not want to get too involved in it. And there was, oh yeah.
Yeah, we've got,
Next
We've
one.
got, yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
that's a map of the.
That's the map of Sudan
Yeah.
itself. Yeah, we'll come back to that. And eventually, long story cut short, they sent General Gordon, who had been in the Sudan working for the Egyptian government in the 1870s. They sent Gordon, another Royal Engineer, to Khartoum to evacuate the Europeans and the Egyptians from Khartoum before the Mahdist army came and took it. And Gordon decided to stay put and face the Mahdi himself. I think possibly Gordon thought it was a good battle of religions. He being an evangelical Christian, he would face down the Islamic Mahdi. And in the end, Gordon would be cut off. And the British government was forced to react. They sent Wolseley to try and rescue him. It was a botched campaign. Done at the wrong time of year when the Nile was low, because you have to go against the flow of the Nile, and the flood had abated by this time. And Wolseley was trying to go along the Nile route. And Kitchener and Leslie Rundle, who had also worked with him later on, they were sent out as intelligence officers to scout the area around Berber. And Kitchener then got involved with a loyal Arab tribe as well. He dressed as an Arab, only his blue eyes gave him away. And he did very well. He was the last British officer in contact with Gordon and would be given his diaries later on and would write the last part of the official history of the campaign where he...
So is it true that Gordon, of course, died, and that was a huge incident in British history of that period, and then Kitchener took, what, nearly 10 years to avenge his death?
Yeah.
Why did it take so long?
Well, the British government didn't want to get involved. The subsequent governments, they certainly by that time, once Britain had held Egypt, they had made, particularly the Liberal government had made promises that they wouldn't stay long. And of course they did, which infuriated the French. And so the British were soon aware, of course, if you hold Egypt, you've got to hold the Nile as well, because Egypt depends on the Nile. The British governments over from the 1880s to the 1890s were quite happy in a way for the Mahdists and the successor of the Mahdi, the Khalifa, to hold the Nile in the Sudan because they were no threat really at all. What the British didn't want was particularly for the French to get anywhere near it, and the Germans and the Belgians as well. The British were determined that they would hold the valley of the Nile. And so there was no reason anyway to go to conquer the Sudan, because Lord Cromer in Egypt wanted to get Egypt's finances back in order. And so it was the reconquest of the Sudan was delayed. By 1894, I think it is, Kitchener is now in charge of the Egyptian army. He is the Sirdar, and he is determined that Britain will retake the Sudan, and he's preparing the Egyptian army for it as well. And then in 1896, because of the Italians being heavily defeated by the Abyssinians, they call on the British for some help because they felt they were going to be attacked by the Mahdists. The British agreed and told Kitchener he could advance into the Sudan. It was not meant to be a campaign of conquest. It was meant to be a limited operation, but its momentum just sort of carried through. A special military operation, yeah, but this time much more successful, well planned, well thought out. And Kitchener had seen how it had all gone wrong to try and rescue Gordon. And he was not going to do it that way. He was going to use the river, but not in its entirety. And he was always, when he used the river, it was always going to be when it was in flood. And so he could actually sail.
But he also
boats.
built a railway.
Yeah, that's the thing
How
on the
long was
map.
that?
As you could see, the desert or the Sudan Military Railway, Kitchener always intended to do it. They'd already built a railway down the Nile on the right-hand side there. But
The Nile's on the left, and the railway's on the right. Is that right?
there's the Nile, and it bends up like that. But of course, that means you have to travel a long distance, and there was a bit of a railway there. And but Kitchener had always envisaged building that railway across the desert, the short route. And Kitchener thought as well, because of his Royal Engineering training, and he believed, and he sent troops into the desert to check that there's water there. And they found 2 wells, where Kitchener had said they probably would find water. And these, no one in thousands of years had ever found water there before. But you know, Kitchener's luck, as one journalist would call it, certainly played out in this respect. But I think it's also his technical skill as well, and with the other Royal Engineers who were there. And once they found these 2 wells, it made building the railway much more viable. And Kitchener got his railway across the Bayou de Desert, and that basically made the campaign a lot easier. And
Would you say that his success in Omdurman and Sudan was a product of his preparation and his
Yes.
technical skill,
He's spent
rather than his military?
yeah, yes,
Yeah, he spent those 10 years effectively working the situation in his favour. If accountants, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to go and see how he manipulates the accounts to have one thing built for one purpose and then decides it's not worth it anymore. That's not the intention, and he changes its purpose in order to get the next bit of budget to do the next bit. And that eventually leads to the railway. So we have a prison built, which actually is a warehouse and such things. And it's remarkable following it through.
You're making him sound more like a politician than a
He's a very astute politician who is not a politician. He's a political player, in my view. He's an astute political player, but he is not a politician.
And did he choose not to enter that route, or was he encouraged to go into politics at any time?
No.
Well, army officers in the empire were often politicians as well. They had to govern territories. Kitchener did govern the eastern Sudan. When the British evacuated Sudan, they kept the port on the Red Sea, Suakin. And that was, Kitchener got a very grand title for just a smelly little port town on the Red Sea, basically, where he was wounded, in fact, fighting the Mahdists around there. I think he got a bullet in the chin, and in the end, they couldn't dig it out and he had to swallow it, I think, and let nature take its course, as they said.
Yeah.
And so he had opportunity to govern an area, and was very, again, astute in knowing what to do. And that was certainly to cut off trade to the interior, because that would weaken the opposition, which it did as well. And but he was also, I've got to a pragmatist and a realist. He always knew how to deal with the locals. And when before he became Sirdar of the army, for example, he was put in charge of the Egyptian police force. And he basically didn't change much at all, because he didn't want the British to be too overbearing. And he told the Egyptians who already worked there to carry on. And that made life a lot easier for all
Would it be true
concerned.
to say that the whole positioning of Britain in Egypt and Sudan, which we quote unquote annexed from the Ottoman Empire, really to protect the Suez Canal and pursue interest, it was really a political and engineering job that he was doing. And when he got to Omdurman, he had, I mean, the odds of him winning were very high, right?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, there wasn't a lot of military strategy involved in Omdurman. It was a massacre.
Yeah, Kitchener was not a particularly great tactical battlefield commander. At the big battle in the early 1898 against the Mahdists at the Abara River, Kitchener brought the army to where it was needed. The Mahdists under the Emir Mahmud were sort of set in their fortified camp. Kitchener gave command of the battle to Archibald Hunter, who was his main battlefield commander, let him get on with it with the commander of the British brigade. British troops had arrived by this time to fight with the Egyptian army, and he let them get on with it. The battle unfolded, and the British and Egyptians won it fairly comfortably. Similarly, at Omdurman as well, the climactic battle of this campaign, Kitchener left it to Hunter as well, to deploy the armies, British division by this time, and the Egyptian army, and let the officers get on with it. But Kitchener didn't play any real tactical
Some of the
role.
books, the biographers tend to suggest that he didn't delegate very well, but it sounds to me that
Yeah, in
that
that
was
case it was,
delegation.
yes, yeah, he knew that they were better at it than he was.
If he trusts
we're
you.
going
if
to
he
struggle
trusts
to
you-
get through the Boer War in the half time. I want to call a little comfort half-time break. Let's have literally a few remarks on to wrap up Egypt, Sudan, and then we'll have a break and we'll come back and do South Africa. There's a lot to get through.
Well, Kitchener had prepared for the campaign, and he brought with his army every sort of modern Victorian technology that was available. Railway, modern gunboats, machine guns, modern artillery. The British force was armed with the up-to-date rifles. The Egyptians were not particularly, but that didn't matter. The Sudan campaign is really a campaign against nature, and Kitchener overcame the natural obstacles of the river and the desert to get what it, get where he wanted and to get what he wanted as well. Yeah, just want to point out that after the Battle of Omdurman, which was fought on the 2nd of September 1898, Kitchener opened sealed orders that he'd been given and was told that a French expedition had planted itself at Fashoda on the Upper Nile, and he was ordered to go and deal with it. It was about 120 odd French officers and Senegalese soldiers based there, and Kitchener took with him a substantial military force, and they tended to get on very well. He established a force by the French force just to keep an eye on them, but the French were told in fairly certain terms that they could not stay there, and rather than risk a shooting war at that point, Kitchener advised the French Captain Marchand that this probably was best left to the British and French governments to sort out in the meantime. But what Kitchener did was to effectively isolate the French garrison, and then Kitchener wrote dispatches to the British government and basically to the rest of the world to say that the French were in dire straits on the Nile, which they were not, and something needs to be done. And he painted a very bleak picture for the French, which was not really true, but it gave, the French government had no idea about the condition of their men, so they had to take what the British said for granted. And the British also threatened the French with war if they were going to, argue the toss about it. But what Kitchener did, to say in very diplomatic way, was to make sure that the British won this political battle with the French, and to avoid, in effect, a war, because the French had no idea really what was going on in that part of the Nile, and he was very clever in that respect.
I think added to that was Kitchener actually ensured that the force was dressed in the Egyptian army uniform with the Egyptian flag.
Yes.
So it wasn't Britain against France, it was France against the Egyptian army. And because it was in Egypt, that took precedence as well. Very, very clever.
That was clever as well.
Smith Dorian was in charge
Yeah,
of
he
that
was there. Yeah,
unit.
yeah.
He features quite a lot, Smith
Yeah.
Dorian. But yeah, sorry.
And then Kitchener would later be the first sort of Governor General of the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. He would start the rebuilding of Khartoum and found Khartoum University, was it there? It
was called
Gordon College.
Gordon College, that's right, yeah,
Now
named
it's
after
the
Gordon.
University of Khartoum.
Yeah, and that was seemingly going well enough, although he did cut costs, I think, which would cause a mutiny in one of the regiments, although some of the Egyptian soldiers were nationalists who caused trouble there after he'd left. But then the war in South Africa broke out on the 11th of October 1899, and by the end of the year, the British had suffered some defeats, 3 in 1 week, known as Black Week, and the British government decided to change the high command, and they opted for the 5'4", I think, in his socks, Lord Roberts, and decided, and Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, decided that Kitchener should go as his chief of staff, basically, which meant nothing. But Kitchener should go as someone to look after Roberts, and you have strange picture of the 6'2" Kitchener with the 5'4" Roberts. But they did make a very effective team, and Kitchener was in effect Roberts's how can I put it? Firefighter, yeah. He was sent to deal with various crises that erupted on the line of march and things like that. There was one area, the Battle of Paardeberg in February 1900, where Kitchener was in charge of, are we on? Yeah, in what was then the Orange Free State. But he took tactical control of the battle, and it was the bloodiest battle of the war in South Africa, if memory serves. The British lost quite heavily, and Kitchener was criticised for his tactical handling. It was not his finest hour, but the problem was the British lacked decent staff officers. They lacked a decent staff in general, and Kitchener had to more or less do everything himself, galloping around the various units to try and get them to attack or whatever. And so he was criticised for his handling of that battle, but Roberts never blamed him for the high casualty rates or anything else, because one thing that even one of Kitchener's critics, Thomas Pakenham, in his History of the Boer War, admits that the British Army was, very raring to go, to get stuck in to the Boers, rather than just sit down and besiege them in their wagon lager. And so Kitchener sort of got away with that. But then as we go through 1900, the Boers are effectively defeated. The two states, the Boer states, Transvaal and Orange Free State, are annexed by the British. The war is over, according to Lord Roberts, who goes home and leaves Kitchener in charge, basically seemingly to mop up the few Boer commandos who are engaged in guerrilla warfare. And Kitchener will find that this is much more difficult than anyone thought would be at the end of 1900. The war will last another 18 months. And it is a guerrilla war. And Kitchener is one of the first commanders of the 20th century to be confronted with a guerrilla war, and probably one of the few ones that could say was successful in doing so as well. Now, this is where things get controversial, because Kitchener, quite early on in December 1900, issued a circular memorandum number 29, which basically was a declaration of war against Boer women in general, because it ordered the army to destroy farms, kill livestock that they couldn't take off, and bring the women and children in to what became known as the concentration camps. They were brought into camps by the railway line. The idea, which is possibly suggested by surrendered Boers to Kitchener as well, saying that the women were the ones who were keeping the war going because their farms supplied food and intelligence to the men still on commando. And if they sort of took those away, then this would defeat the, well, what's the term for the Boers? Oh, it's gone out of my head. Not the hands up as the other one. Bitter enders, yeah, the bitter enders. Yeah. And so this is what Kitchener did, and he ordered his troops to do. So you have a swathe of farm burnings, destruction throughout the two former Boer republics. Women and children brought to these camps, which were sited really for military convenience by the railway lines. And then consequently, you have deaths within the camps, particularly of the children. Thousands will die in the camps, and Kitchener,
Typhoid, dysentery.
yeah, and
so let's deal a little bit with the morality of all this. You said it's controversial, and you must have views on this whole thing, to say the least.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I was just going to say there has been more research done on this. Some very nationalist Afrikaners over the years have accused Kitchener and the British of genocide, and there is a particular image of a girl named Lizzie Van Zyl, who's the photograph of her. She is skeletal, and it was often put about, even until recent times, that she was starving to death because of British actions. More recent research has shown that this is not true. She was dying of typhoid. And this was a problem in South Africa. It was endemic in South Africa, typhoid. British soldiers had died in their droves, including one of the Queen Victoria's grandsons as well out there because of typhoid. And also there had been a measles epidemic raging in South Africa before the war, and the camps just exacerbated that as well. And that was what carried off most of the children. The Boer civilians were not used to being brought together. They lived on farms that had, neighbours lived many miles away. They were all brought together, put into British Army tents because that's all were available at the time. And so, it was breeding grounds for disease. And so that is the sort of background to the camps, but it wasn't a policy of the British or Kitchener to commit genocide. I think that is all wrong.
You want to touch on that?
Yeah. So Kitchener is labelled with the issue of the concentration camp. The first concentration camps had only been started or been used in the Spanish War, 1896. So not very much earlier than
the rebellion in Cuba,
the
wasn't
rebellion in Cuba. So it was a new idea of bringing people together to remove them from potential battlefields. The Boers in the beginning were quite grateful for Kitchener having moved the women off the farms, because we have in South Africa then, and I think we still have today, what is known as the Black Fear or the Swart Gevaar, which is, and in those days it was very, very strong, where white people feared that the black person was going to kill them. And so if you had white women left on their own on the farms, the local black employees would kill the women, etc. So the Boers, by all accounts, were quite happy initially for their women to be taken off the farms and put into camps where they would be protected from the black masses. That wasn't always the case. The relationship between black and white on the farms in some cases was very, very good and very, very close. So this is all part of the mythology that comes along. Having women so close together, as Keith has mentioned, the Afrikaans Boer woman, you were too close to your neighbour if you could see the farm smoke from the farm next door. So you can imagine how women living very independently, all of a sudden being brought into camps where they are a couple of meters away from each other, hygiene aspects, which they just go out into the local bush when you've got nobody around for however many miles. Now all of a sudden close together, we have floods, huge rain downfalls, which can cause flooding. That water masses up, and it's an ideal spreading place for typhoid, etc. Kitchener is quite aware of this, and he's starting to put pressure on Lord Milner, who's the administrator at the time, to take the camps over from an administrative point of view so that better order can get put in. We also, part of the research that Keith was referring to, has identified that it depends on the camp officer as to how well the camp is run and how effective things are. It's person management, effectively.
Yeah, it was difficult for the camp officers because they didn't know from one day to the next how many people they would have in their camp. They might order rations for 500 people, and then when the rations arrived, by that time there was 1,000 people in the camp. So there was always these issues, and I think in general as well, there was this issue about the civilians in control, because the areas of Transvaal and the Orange River Colony, as it became, were under military government. General Maxwell in the Transvaal and General Gould Adams in the Orange River Colony, and they had to liaise with the civilians, and it was not always so easily done, was it?
Yeah, and there's also the issue of, are the women military prisoners or are they internees? Because if they're supporting and literally feeding the men passing through, then they actually become prisoners of war because they are militarily involved in a campaign. If they just happen to be taken away for being protected and they're not known to be supporting the Boers, then they are internees. And there's this, so it's a different kind of management system. So you've got all of this. Kitchener doesn't see the women, even those that are helping the Boers, as prisoners. He sees them as civilians and as you know, they, as people, they're not part of the military system. And that's why he's wanting to try and pass stuff over to Milner. In the meantime, just to muddy the waters even more, news of these deaths and that are getting back to Britain, and Emily Hobhouse gets sent out.
That bloody woman, as Kitchener called her, yeah.
Yes, and she raises, with family connections and everything in Manchester Guardian, etc., raises the issue of the camps, and that becomes a huge big issue here as well in Britain. At the same time, Millicent Fawcett is sent out to South Africa, she of suffragette fame and who has her statue now in Parliament Square, is sent out to go and investigate as well. And she actually manages a meeting with Kitchener about the whole issue. And both of them are very impressed with the other. She says about Kitchener, the meeting with Kitchener, it is the most productive meeting she has ever had with anybody at that level. And her request simply is that Kitchener will allow her to put an extra carriage on the back of all the trains passing through. Kitchener's responsibility is the army. All she wants is a carriage on the back, which she will pay for out of the funds that she has raised, with food to go to the camps. And Kitchener says absolutely 100%. So there is stuff coming through, but because that doesn't tally up and fit in with the rhetoric and the media information that Emily Hobhouse is sending through, which ties in with the anti-war movement here, led by Lloyd George and the Liberals, you have this hiding away, this covering up of what Kitchener is actually doing.
Yeah, the term methods of barbarism was used by the leader of the Liberal Party to describe, it was a rhetorical question.
The Second World War was Britain's Vietnam. I mean, they got very bogged down.
But they won it.
That's the-
British won it. That's the difference. It worked. Yeah, I know it was
did
drastic,
work.
but it worked.
So from a military point of view, it definitely
Yeah,
worked.
yeah.
And, you know, one has to give him credit for that. Are you going to go on and just talk about the peace? Because I mean,
There's a question back there.
There's a question mark, yeah.
Sorry, I just was, can you say something about the domestic British involvement in the Boer War? Because all the house and poetry, which we think of as being related to the First World War, is actually about the Boer War. And am I right, or, and again, I'm speaking real ignorance, that there were a lot of British soldiers sent over to that country?
Yes, because it lasted longer than anyone thought it would, and the scale of the theatre was huge. I think South Africa is as big as Germany and France put together. They needed more men, and they were so desperate the army dropped recruiting standards to their lowest ever. I think it was. If I remember, I did read a thesis on the medical history of the war. I think by the end of the war, the average height of the British soldier was 5'3". It was the smallest army the British ever put out, and was a real indictment of living standards in urban Britain. The Manchester Recruiting Office, I think, is the famous example where, despite the recruiting standards being dropped, they were still rejecting a third of the men who were coming forward. In the end, about 450,000 men passed through South Africa. The army, I think, at its height was about 250,000 at the end, and others. They had a lot of volunteers after 1900. You get the City Imperial Volunteers, or city workers and middle class men particularly. They called for volunteers from, well, Canada sent troops, the Australian colonies before Australia was federated, New Zealand sent troops, no Maoris. The Cape government, despite being British, did not want Maoris coming in because they were not considered white. And then Kitchener, of course, recruited Black Africans. And questions were asked by the British government, how many of you recruited? Because some people were complaining, and Kitchener told a lie, basically. I think he said, what, 10,000? It was a lot more, a lot more. And then the question was, how many of them are armed? He said, well, we've only armed about, say, 10,000. He didn't include the ones who brought their own guns as well. And these were vital for manning what they called the blockhouse lines. The countryside was divided up with barbed wire a blockhouse every mile, telephone lines link them, all sorts of things. Again, they were using all the modern technology they could. And they were denying the Boer Commando space and destroying the countryside within it. And it was slow, and Kitchen got very frustrated at times because it was so slow, but he stuck it out. And you know, that was certainly, you can put determination down as one of Kitchener's characteristics.
There's a huge mismatch between the numbers of troops that the Boer side had. I mean, it took them 30, 40,000.
Yeah.
So
it was being whittled down
and
slowly.
the army, the British army was about 250,000 to 300,000. A complete mismatch, totally different approach to fighting in terms of tactics and equipment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
but they were being chased as well. You see, this is the thing, the Boers were given no peace at all. You had all these troops manning these blockhouse lines, but within the areas that the blockhouses covered, you had mounted columns, and they got better and better as time went on. The first columns used to trundle out with artillery and wagons and everything else. By the end, they were fighting the Boers as the Boers themselves, simply mounted columns who could were using Africans for scouts as well, who knew the country, and also surrendered Boers as well. And they were fighting the Boers as the Boers were fighting as well. So the British were wearing them down very nicely in a way. And in the end, May 1902, most of the Boers decided they'd had enough, and that was that.
so was it a success for Kitchener?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I say, he is one of the few generals of the 20th century to have defeated a national guerrilla war.
And I think the other thing is that he was the one who orchestrated the peace. in a
Yes,
way.
absolutely.
So,
He tried a couple, yeah, he'd already tried once.
Yeah, 1901.
There
Yeah,
were two attempts, yeah,
Yeah.
on the piece.
Yeah.
One failed and one succeeded.
Yeah, so in 1901, I think it was February 1901,
Yeah.
Kitchener got a message through the Boer General Louis Botha's wife, who happened to be Irish, Annie. Annie Emmett, Emmets were famous Irish rebels, as far as I understand.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, so she was married to Louis, and Kitchener used her to get a message to Louis to come to Apali. And it supposedly one of them taught the other one bridge at this. And Kitchener was prepared to end the war then. However, Milner refused to accept anything short of unconditional surrender by the Boers, and wrote back to London to say he wasn't prepared to accept the terms that Kitchener and Botha were happy with. Shortly after that, Milner came to Britain to actually try and get Kitchener removed from being commanding officer, which meant that Kitchener had to pick up Milner's job as well. So
High
he's
Commissioner.
High Commissioner, he's managing the army, he's managing the civil administration, and in a role that Roberts had actually said was too much, or just the military side was too much for one man at the beginning. So, and yet Kitchener is held responsible for all of this. So the war continues because of Milner's works back here in Britain. And then in 1902, Kitchener again suggests to the Boers that they come to the table. And he does a lot of work behind the scenes in Melrose House in Pretoria, has the Boers staying next door with Ian Hamilton, and negotiates that. The Boers take a bit longer than they should to make the decision, which Kitchener can see Milner turning over, but they're about 10 minutes late with signing the actual document. But Kitchener manages to placate Milner so that it is actually
So there was a
signed.
piece for which we
There was a
have to say that part of the military aspect of grinding this campaign to a conclusion, he takes a lot of credit for the peace.
Yeah.
as well,
I
which
think
just shows this political side.
Yeah,
again.
he was much more of a realist. Milner, who was the High Commissioner for South Africa and had his own ideas about what post-war South Africa should be. He hoped to turn Transvaal into a British colony. That's where the goldfields are,
Sure.
and to bring out British settlers and everything else. And he wanted to deal with the surrendered Boers. Now, Kitchener knew full well that the Boer population would never accept these hands-uppers, who were particularly those who'd fought with the British or for the British. They would never be acceptable to the Boer population, and that would be trouble for the British thereafter. So Kitchener always felt that the ones you deal with are the Boer generals who are fighting against you, like Botha, Smuts of Transvaal, Christian de Wet of the Orange Free State as
And
well.
the result was, not many years later, the Union of South Africa was created with mainly Afrikaner
Botha and Smuts running it.
management
Yeah,
running it.
it's Kitchener
plays a
foresaw.
lot of credit.
Yeah, he foresaw that at the end, the British would have to give South Africa over to the Boers because they were the white majority. No one considered the blacks at this time, that was just
Different context.
different context altogether, yeah. And but Kitchener knew that in the end, the Boers would rule South Africa, so better to have friends than enemies. And because of Kitchener's realism and basically playing the good cop in the peace negotiations, he got the right Boer generals to surrender and who would later accept British rule and South Africa being part of the empire, and which played a part in both world wars.
Mr. Cumming?
The context of the surrender, the negotiations, we're used to instantaneous global communications. How much was Kitchener able to operate completely independently of London?
Not too much. They were in telegraphic communications, so it was about 24 hours that communications of importance would be going through. Milner had a very clear brief on what he was to accept. There'd been that kind of discussion going through. The other part of it, Kitchener, this is where his astuteness comes in as well. The thing is that he, during a break, he took, happened to be on the veranda with Smuts or Botha. Well, sources vary as to which of the two it exactly was, but one of the significant Boers, and said to them that in about 1905 there was going to be an election in Britain, which definitely the Liberals would win, and that would ensure that the Boers were given back their independence or responsible government, and that was one of the turning points in the signing of the agreement. And it's that astuteness.
And by then, is it fair to say Kitchener was in a bit of a hurry? He'd been in the South Africa for a bit of time. It wasn't his natural comfort zone as a place. He had ambitions. He had other ambitions. So let's move on because time is, I'm afraid, we've got two more pieces to try and deal with next half an hour, let's say. One is his transition into his position in the First World War as Secretary of State for War. And secondly, we want to have this big wrap up on the man and the character and what we take away from it. By the way, there is some water at the back because I noticed that you were all eating sandwiches, but there was not apart from hot drinks, there is some water at the back if you want to fill a glass there over there. But anyway, let's now quite rapidly move through India and all of that period into 1914.
Okay, yeah. Very quickly afterwards, Kitchener certainly wanted to be Commander-in-Chief in India. Some historians have said this was always in his mind and this is what influenced his policy in South Africa.
India.
Yeah, up to a point it did, but not Kitchener was not going to leave South Africa unresolved. He was always going to stick that out.
Until he came to a conclusion.
Yeah. And which, happened. And so, happily he went to India. He famously fell out with the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, over military reform. It's a bit technical and I've had to bring notes in for it. And I won't go into too much detail, but
it's interesting that Milner was the civil administrator in South Africa and Curzon in India, and he seemed to have fallen out with both of them.
Yeah, and he beat both of them as well.
And he beat them hands down.
Yeah, and Kitchener had certainly laid his groundwork for India because he was very well in with the family of the former Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. And he had an admirer in Salisbury's daughter-in-law, Lady Cranborne. Would she be the next Lady Salisbury after he died? Yeah. And she was an admirer of Kitchener and they wrote a lot of letters to one another. And she helped lay the political groundwork in Britain to back up anything that Kitchener really...
And they had a rather arcane dispute, which I don't think we need to go into,
no,
about the organisation of the
Yeah.
army and the way the so-called military member took place on the council, the
Yeah.
viceroy.
Kitchener certainly had the military member who was a junior soldier who was basically the one giving advice to the viceroy
Yeah,
and sometimes overruled the commander in chief. And that certainly happened before Kitchener, and Kitchener got really annoyed because Curzon went with this Major General Ellis, went on a tour of the Northwest Frontier, which was basically a military frontier without Kitchener. And he's the commander in chief, so he was, say, pissed off to say the least. And he wanted rid of this official. And he got his way, and it would cost Curzon his job. Curzon was skating on thin ice because he had really fell out with the British Army over a good reason. The army in India, some soldiers had, did they kill? Did you know? Some soldiers had raped an Indian servant. And the army would not give them up for punishment. So Curzon punished the whole regiment. He sent them off to Aden, I think, something like that. And there was, I think, another issue as well. So Curzon didn't have the backing of the army, and he'd fallen out with many of the British administrators as well, because Curzon just was telling them how to do their job, and he was doing their job a lot of the time as well. And he was making these old Indian hands run about a lot, which they were not used to. And so he was on thin ice in India, and Kitchener was able to play a good political game because all of this was getting back to, and he was losing, Curzon was losing
it
support.
wasn't just all about this dispute with Curzon. I mean, he did do some serious reorganising.
Yeah, he reorganised the army and got it ready for war with Russia. And then, unfortunately, as it might be, they signed an entente with Russia in 1907. So the sort of reasoning for the Indian Army reforms was sort of, lost. And in the Great Game. And the army was really only expected to fight tribesmen on the Northwest Frontier. So, just another point as well, Kitchener was willing to, what's the word? It's gone out of my head. To agree with Curzon, give Curzon make a concession to Curzon. Compromise, that's the word. Yeah, he was willing to compromise with Curzon over this sort of technical issue. Kitchener had wanted a general staff. The chief of the general staff would be a liaison between the commander in chief and the viceroy, but that was rejected. What happened afterwards? After Kitchener left, the test of the Indian Army came in the First World War, when it was sent to Mesopotamia. And I think the Indian Army landed at Basra, first of all, and a British officer called it the arsehole of the world. And probably many British troops felt the same in recent times as well. And the campaign in 1914-16 did not go well for the British. It would end up in defeat. Kut, General Townsend, and the conditions that the Indian Army fought under were terrible. There was no medical services to speak of. It was very badly managed, and Kitchener would get the blame after his death in what was known as the Mesopotamian Commission in 1917 for his organisation of the army. But historians now point out that after Kitchener left India, the Liberal government cut back on a lot of what Kitchener had wanted and done. For example, the military supply department that Kitchener had established, which was supposed to look after the logistics of the Indian Army, had been scrapped by the Liberal government before the war. And so the Indian Army was without a decent logistical background backing when it went to war in 1914. And this would come to pass in Mesopotamia.
Just very quickly, so we'll fast forward now. We need to just talk about that interlude between India and 1914 and then how he ended up as Secretary of State for War.
Shall I pick up on that? Yeah, so Kitchener effectively does himself out of a job in 1907, but stays in India until 1909 because they don't know what to do with him really. And it's politics here back in Britain.
Beautiful house.
He did, similar. Well, that was the Commander-in-Chief's summer residence, which he redecorated because he needed a place to show all of his collection that he got. So he redesigned the house. It's beautiful. You can find a picture on the website. It's under copyright, so we couldn't put it up here today, but it is a beautiful looking house, which he had found. But in 1909, he ends up jobless. He's unemployed because the Liberal Party won't have anything to do with him. He's a general, he's a troublemaker. He got rid of Curzon, etc., and they don't trust him at all. So he ends up going on a world tour, which is absolutely phenomenal. He goes to China and Japan, where he watches army maneuvers. It's in China that he is accused of stealing artifacts, which I think is actually down to a miscommunication of cultural understanding, given that he'd been spending most of his life in Egypt and India, and then going to China, where there's a different way of accepting gifts and giving them back. And he hadn't realized that and took an extra one too. So that causes.
But he was a
quite
big collector.
He was a big collector. Porcelain was one of his big things. Swords had been a fad earlier on, etc. Goes on his world tour, sees China, Japan, army maneuvers there, very, very significant for what's coming up ahead. He sees there's a war coming along, goes down to New Zealand and Australia, where he is invited to advise them on their military defense, and he recommends railways. There's a railway theme here, which I quite like as well. But he recommends how they can work together with railways. From there, he ends up back in Africa, where he buys a farm, the coffee farm I referred to earlier on, meets up with a whole lot of people he had met back in 1897, I think, when he was on the Zanzibar Boundary Commission. He walked the only boundary that has ever been naturally determined in Africa, apart from rulers in Europe, as in penicillin rulers in Europe. He actually walked a boundary. And that caused some of the problems with the French and the Germans as well, because he's overriding them. Buys his farm in Kenya, is involved in the coronation. George invites him to lead the coronation in 1911, which he does. He then goes over to the United States, where he comments on how lovely the ladies are when he's leaving there. Quite significant for claims that Philip Magnus makes about Kitchener's sexual preferences. And he comments on how lovely the ladies' legs are I think when he's leaving New York. And this gets reported in the press. It's big news in the press here.
Then yet, rather strangely, ends up back in Egypt.
So he comes back to London, and Eldon Gorst is leaving Egypt as consul general, viceroy equivalent, and reluctantly Kitchener is given this job, reluctantly by the politicians. It's Kitchener's next dream job because he can't become viceroy of Egypt. And it is while he is in that role,
Couldn't be viceroy of India.
Viceroy of India. So he takes the equivalent.
He takes back the old role the role that's available in Egypt. Yeah. It's his first love, really, as a country.
I think that's where he feels most comfortable. He understands the culture. He, according to his brother, when he came home on leave here to Britain, he would have cushions when he went to go and stay with Dad. He always stayed with Dad. Kitchener used to sit on the floor on cushions. He never sat on a chair. Because that's what he was most comfortable with.
I mean, this thing of the David Lean's film Lawrence of Arabia, the guy with Lawrence with his flow, he was like this before Lawrence. That was his style. Yeah.
He used to be happiest in the markets in Egypt, rather than meeting with the cavalry officers and other officers in the British camps.
But he was doing a competent job running Egypt. It was the build up to the war. How the hell did he end up as Secretary of State?
So he comes here on holiday. So they would always come back to London for a period of summer break. And the wars tended to break out before summer break because you needed to get the harvest in. There was something to do with always. You can track it. It's rather fascinating. So he's here in London on his summer break to do some business, sort out some personal things. And he knows war is about to break out. He is desperate to get back to Egypt and is literally on the boat when a message comes down to say he is called to London to discuss the war with Asquith. This has been other work behind the scenes, Milner, interestingly, and a chap called Leo Amery together with a few others, are proposing that Kitchener is the best man for the job to take over Secretary of State for War, with war having just
I
about
think
broken out.
even
Curzon comes up,
and
yeah,
Milner were actually supportive.
absolutely.
They realised the man he was.
Yeah.
And Churchill, I think, for a period anyway.
Churchill only when it suited him and when
Yes.
he needed him.
So he ended up, he was asked to be the secretary, well, he's not a politician.
No.
How did all that
So
work?
he's very reluctant to do the job. And it is, Asquith is only able to convince him to take on the role because the king asked him. And in Kitchener's life, there were three priorities: God, we'll come back to religion later, probably, hopefully, his king and his country. But also alongside that, Kitchener's self-preservation. So you've got to balance those three important things: God, king, country, and Kitchener alongside. Had the king not been mentioned in that discussion, I don't think Kitchener would have taken the job. His conditions as well in taking the job, very reluctantly, were that he remained on the same contract as a soldier. 3 years or as long as the war lasted, it's the same enlistment as anybody else, and that he attend the peace conference when that happened. Under those conditions.
And he didn't
would take-
really have to show up in Parliament.
No, well, that's his part of,
So he
he's not
he
going
was
to.
given, quote, light duties
Yeah, I
in
think,
terms of showing up.
I think
in
he did
Parliament.
make a speech in House of Lords at
He
one point.
did go and do a big
Yeah.
speech.
Next
but-
one, you can,
Oh,
yeah, there we go.
So here's some pictures of him in this later period.
Yeah.
He's not young, is he, by this stage?
No,
He'd be
he's
about
63.
6. Well, it depends what you
Well,
call young these days.
Three, yeah.
But yes, in my opinion, he's still quite young.
Do that job for the House of Lords.
No, he's made an earl, or he's given his
After
title
Sudan.
after. Yeah, he's given a title after Sudan, and then he's given a title higher up in the ranks after the South African War. And at that point, he actually asks, this is his clever financing point, somebody asked earlier, for an allowance. So he's paid as well £30,000 along with the title, because he claims that he cannot live the life and
Which
upholds
become
the,
accustomed.
well, to uphold the title and entertain as lords were required to
Before-
without
yeah,
background.
Before we just get into
Mm.
the summation of the man and the character, Keith, what was his accomplishments as Secretary of State for War? I mean, what did he do well? What did he do less well, as it were?
I think the gentleman there said about Kitchener and the French. In the First World War, Kitchener was very mindful of keeping the alliance with the French. And he had to perform a balancing act between the demands of the politicians for results on the battlefronts, keeping the alliance with the French, but also hopefully fighting on the periphery, particularly against the Ottoman Empire as well. Kitchener, as we know from the poster and everything,
Let's look. You have to have the
poster.
although I don't think that was the most famous one at the time, it wasn't particularly well known at the time, was it? I think it becomes afterwards. Kitchener called for volunteers because he always believed a volunteer fights better than a conscript. And I think more men joined up by December 1915 than were conscripted between 1916 and 17. And so his idea is that the strategy is to create a European-sized army, which will not
From scratch.
from scratch, basically. Yeah, there was no sort of template for this at all. To fight or be ready to fight by about 1916. He wanted on the Western Front to be a sort of active defence, no great offensives, but just to keep the Germans pinned down, while with surplus troops, the British could act on the periphery. That was what he wanted. He had schemes about landing in parts of the Ottoman Empire and moving from Egypt and things like that. But of course, the French weren't happy with that. And neither was Sir John French, the British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front during this time. But Kitchener was able to balance, and unfortunately as well for Kitchener, the politicians were putting pressure on him to do something in 1915, which would be mostly the Dardanelles campaign, Gallipoli, and which Kitchener was, I think, generally reluctant to support at first, but then decided that it perhaps had to be supported as well. But he did do a balancing act, and there was no major break during Kitchener's time. And he succeeded really in what he did.
The power drained away though, didn't it?
Yes, he took on too much. That is one thing that historians point
Possible
out.
job.
Yeah, he should have, well, they say that historians say the War Office should not have been in charge of munitions.
Yeah.
And but what Kitchener did, one historian has said what you should judge Kitchener on is the amount of munitions being produced by the end of 1915, not the beginning, when you had the shells shortage crisis and everything else. Certainly by the end of 1915, production had, become very good indeed. And in fact, in early 1915, it wasn't a problem with the amount of shells and munitions, it was the delivery of them. That was the issue. And Kitchener used the usual private companies and was happy for them to be to subcontract to well-known engineering firms. It gave them all experience of making munitions, which Lloyd George could then build on when he created his Ministry of Munitions in 1915. So Kitchener certainly laid the groundwork.
For Lloyd George, saw the
George,
opportunity.
yeah, which Lloyd George really, took over and took the credit for.
And then, of course, we get to June 1916, and he'd been slightly sidelined by that and asked to go and see the Tsar to strengthen the resolve of the Russians.
I think I get the impression. I get the impression by then he was quite happy to give up a lot of that responsibility. He got on with the new chief of the Imperial General Staff, William Robertson.
Yes.
They got on very well. And so Kitchener had no problems there of having a sort of rival soldier in charge as well. And I think he, it was a bit of a relief to him because he couldn't get on with the politicians a lot of the time. He and Lloyd George just didn't get on at all. He got on with Asquith. And in fact, this is what kept Asquith in power, was having Kitchener by his side, quite frankly, because the image of Kitchener was so great by this time that he was seen as the great talisman. And this is a good move on Asquith's part to have Kitchener as Secretary of State for War. In the first place, it kept the government going. Probably
but they had no candidates in the Liberal Party.
No, not really.
Job.
No.
Okay, so we come to events which I think most of us know about. I mean, we lay a lot of stress on this with Kitchener Scholars Association with our events. So let's now just try and sum this up, because again, I don't want to take all of your evening. We could sit here till 11 o'clock, those of us interested, but just try and sum up what can we take away from this career. I mean, I think we've learned a lot tonight about just this range of things that this person got up to. I mean, it wasn't just a regular military career climbing the ranks. I mean, it's all over the place, doing a lot of things and getting results. So what about him and relationships with other people? And you're ready to talk about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and to do it quickly.
Yes,
that's the challenge.
Quickly.
That's the big challenge.
Yeah.
Well, but the big thing is that Kitchener's reputation was quite damaged by Philip Magnus, who claimed in 1964 that Kitchener was homosexual. There is absolutely no evidence. He eventually did admit, having had a discussion with the Countess of Jersey, that he had made a mistake. But by that time, the book had been published. Magnus had made a mistake. Sorry, thank you. By that time, the damage had been done, and that has carried on. Jeremy Paxman writing a big piece about.
I think Emma would be on the side. If she were here, she would be coming in on that point. And also the other big biographer, Pocock, he also continued a little bit of that story, I think.
The questions have been there. And part of the evidence for that they supply is that Kitchener insisted that the men who worked for him were not married. And when you actually look at the data, a lot of the men who worked for him either got married while they were working for him or married shortly after, and he remained very good friends with them. Wolseley backed him up on this as well. And the reason he didn't want married men was because their attentions would be divided. And this goes back to being in Egypt, where a lot of the men who were fighting down in Sudan had their wives back in the cantonments, whatever, back in Egypt, and they were having affairs, supposedly. I haven't done the research.
General
into that.
Maxwell's wife, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, one.
And so this was causing a lot of stress for some of the men out on the front. And so their attentions were divided and they couldn't do proper soldiering because of this. And so that was one of the reasons why he wanted men.
So, I mean, he never got
Single.
married, so he's, the modern summation would be he's a
Yes,
celibate.
yes. And the, Rose, she ran the first hotel in Britain by a woman. Rose Cook, I think it's her, Rose.
Not sure.
She claims that Kitchener had his last meal at her hotel before he went up to Scotland.
Okay.
That fateful journey. He regularly had meals there. And she claims that Kitchener was one of those men who was in love with his job.
That's the point.
And she would have known him pretty well, given the number of meals.
And what
that
about
they
his
had.
relationships with women?
His relationships with women were phenomenal. He's one of the most egalitarian people I have ever come across. You've referred to his relationship with Alice Cranbourne.
Yeah.
There is absolutely, and I've spoken to the Salisbury archivists, Salisbury family archivists as well. There is no evidence of there having been any sexual relationship between them. It was purely platonic, a meeting of minds like you cannot believe. Kitchener accused politicians of telling secrets on pillows. Well, Kitchener was guilty of writing his innermost thoughts to Alice. He would actually work out his military problems in his letters to Alice. And if you get a chance to go and read those at Hatfield House, it's an absolute must. They are beautiful. As an insight into his thinking. He also got on incredibly well with Etty Desborough, Lord Grenfell, Etty Desborough, yeah, whose son Julian Grenfell.
The other one as well.
Both sons were killed.
Mm.
Julian's photograph was apparently the only photograph that Kitchener ever had on his desk. And there was a picture of the War Office there. Very young looking Kitchener when you consider the photograph that we've got on the first slide.
Can we go back and have a look?
It's the artist's impression. They've taken the young Kitchener and imposed it on him as a 63-year-old, which they've done in the middle photo. It's a very young.
That's him in the War Office.
That's him
It's
in
a
the War
holding
Office.
court,
Yeah. And you compare that with the man in civilian outfit on the right,
Left.
on the left, but on
Yeah.
the right of the photo, the
Yeah.
left, yeah. Where he's meeting soldiers, wounded soldiers at his house in Broome, down in Canterbury.
And that was the one place he bought. He didn't have a house in the UK, but he bought Broome in Kent.
Yes,
And this was going to be where he was
his
going to
summer
retire.
holiday,
and
his
he
summer
could-
house.
But he never lived
No.
there. It was all
Yeah.
fell apart.
And he got his daughter, he got his niece to actually do the overseeing of the construction of Broome. While he was out in Egypt, his niece looked after that.
Wasn't he also pretty close to we talked about Curzon and the
Yeah.
terrible dispute, but I think also the wife,
Yes, Mary Curzon, yeah,
he was quite close.
yeah, very. Mary Curzon was American, and the story goes that Kitchener understood her better than Lord Curzon did. And on the 4th of July, it's really
Quite a
interesting.
statement.
It is. On the 4th of July, the 1 year they were there, Kitchener had her round to dinner to celebrate the American 4th of July independence, which Curzon could never understand why this was so important for her. And that's, I think, where this understanding bit comes. And she claims that her dream of having dinner with an English general, British general, had come to fruition on the 4th of July. Also, when she had a baby, which happened to be a girl as opposed to a boy, Kitchener was Curzon was very upset because, of course, it's the hereditary line. And Kitchener actually convinced Curzon that this was quite okay. It wasn't the end of the world. And so he helped manage the family relationship. And it is also said, Mary dies about 6 months after the Curzons come back to the UK. And part of that is said that she died of a broken heart, not having been able to restore the relationship between Curzon and Kitchener. Also, while out in India, Kitchener had worked very closely with Mary to sort out tropical medicine. Mary had a big interest in tropical medicine, and Kitchener worked with her on that, because obviously if they could sort out some of the tropical diseases, that would help the army as well. So they had a very close working relationship, and so the severance of the friendship between Curzon and Kitchener took its toll very heavily on Mary.
Okay, I
in
mean, there's a
particular.
lot we can say here.
Yeah.
The collecting, the Freemasonry, the religious faith, the interest in education. You know, these are all evidence of a much wider personality than one would imagine. Now, what are Keith?
We've got one question from the internet.
Yes, sir.
If I may. Andy Smith asked, would Anne and Keith like to say anything about Kitchener's beliefs, the importance of his religious faith or Freemasonry?
Yes, well, that's a good point. Bring in.
Should I-
God, yeah, I
Right.
think you know more.
Yeah. Kitchener was a very strong Church of England. That's what he'd been brought up with. Whilst at Woolwich, he joined the Army Guild of the Holy Standard, which was an extreme group, high church
Absolutely.
of England, which is really very interesting. And he used to try and recruit people for it.
Okay.
Yeah, he worked very closely with Reverend Edgehill as well, who was padre at Woolwich. He's then, and this is why I was going on about language and the work he did in Palestine, particularly. Those experiences opened him up to Islam. And he took on a lot of the Islamic ideas as well within his, I think he saw a lot of similarity between them. And before one of the battles in Egypt, Sudan, it took place on a Good Friday. It took place on Good Friday, which happened to be a Friday, being the Islamic sacred day as well. Before that, Kitchener had actually gone to do Friday prayers with a local tribe, which recruited him a whole stack of men free of charge. I think he got 2,000 men from that tribe because he participated in Friday prayers. But he also consulted with his senior Muslim officer about whether it was appropriate to fight on a Friday, to which his officer replied, the Prophet Muhammad had fought on a Friday, it is therefore acceptable. Ian Hamilton, who was the Christian advisor at that point, said, it's Good Friday, you're going to liberate people, it is acceptable. Okay. And so the battle took place on Good Friday, which they won. He's very sensitive to the religious side. His other part of the Turkish aspect, learning Turkish and also Islamic law, was that he could then use that to bring about political change and better equality for people in Egypt, realizing that by doing that, you would prevent war and you'd prevent civil war. Similarly, to keep the peace there, he refused to allow Christian missions to set up where there were already strong Islamic schools going, because he didn't want the conflict to happen. That caused a huge conflict here, you can imagine, because he's supposedly Christian from a Christian country, and he is blocking the spread of Christianity in a Muslim territory. He was also very particular about which Islamic groups could function in their mission stations in the area in order to keep the peace. But very, very sensitive to all of that.
So, yeah, I'm just going to come back on a couple of themes there. So we've got a man who seems to demonstrate a lot of human warmth, a lot of close relationships, a lot of religious sensitivity. And yet you also hear stories about he could be quite irascible, serving officer. He did suffer fools gladly, in a sense. Keith, what do you make of this personality? If you focus a little bit now back on the military side, there seems to be something that needs reconciling in this character.
Yeah, in Sudan, Kitchener was always walking on the tightrope because he feared being replaced by a general from the British Army, and that made him very tense indeed. And so that can explain why I think it was Lord Edward Cecil, Salisbury's son, said Kitchener was, you know, a boor, B-O-O-R, a lot of the
Yeah.
time, and was very rude and whatever. But it was just the strain that Kitchener was under, particularly in Sudan, and then similarly in South Africa as well. You know, he was not relaxed. He was very, you know, and you can understand why he was very short with a lot of people.
So
a lot of the
until he
time.
relaxed,
Yeah.
he wasn't
Exactly.
very relaxed.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Yeah,
when he relaxed.
yeah, he was fine.
And this issue about, you know, in this whole period, we had governments being very blowing in the wind about the support they gave. So he was a manager, as it were, being often starved of resources, as well as the conditions under which he was operating in difficult climate,
Yeah.
difficult.
In Sudan.
No wonder it's largely an impossible job
Yeah.
to some extent.
Because Sudan had to be done on the cheap, because it was largely paid for by the Egyptians, although the British government would send some funds at crucial times as well.
Yeah.
He's said to be the only general to have come in under budget.
Probably, yeah, and yeah, they certainly lots of cutbacks and things like that.
Okay, so
But
let's just have one very last question for both of you, each of you in turn. What can people living in the 21st century, trying to make their career in whatever walk of life they've chosen, good Kitchener scholar type people, what can we take away from this man? The good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, what can be motivating? I mean, we've heard a hell of a lot of very motivating material. Do you have a summation, Keith?
well, if you look at the Sudan plan ahead,
Plan and be thorough.
be thorough, yeah. Be determined when you are doing something, as he was in South Africa, determined to finish it. Be determined to get your own way, as he was in India. And be equitable, I
See the other
suppose.
person's point of view.
Yeah, be pragmatic, be a realist, that know your ground.
What's
I
your?
think for me, it's,
You do, am I right in thinking you go round some groups like, I'm using the expression like Rotary Club, but and you talk about Kitchener in
Yeah.
that context of how people today can learn from it. What, you know, what's the
Yeah.
thrust of your remarks in that context?
for me, it's about, you know, Kitchener is a very, very loyal man. He's got his priorities. He knows what he wants, and he will do whatever he can to make sure that that happens. In terms of whether he's right or wrong, I think he spends a lot of time working out the logistics behind things, so pragmatic but realism as well. Lays the ground very clearly, understands who he's working with, doesn't always get it right, and will deal with that as well. But for me, he's very, very loyal. He never speaks in public about letting people down. He has others potentially do so for him, but he never says it himself. And I think his faith is actually very, very strong and very important. And that can be a faith in, you know, any type of faith that keeps you motivated and going. And treating people with respect. I think that's where the egalitarianism I spoke of, I think comes from a respect for other people, irrespective of what level they are. He could speak to the poorest person, and he had open house in Egypt for the peasants to come and speak to him, which they did. You know, he could, and it's respect for individuals, which I think got him through a lot of difficult points or parts. And this comes back to the question I think you were asking at the beginning, so about what makes him different. And why he gets so much criticism. And I think it's because people didn't understand that. He didn't come through the school system here, so he wasn't of the in crowd, but he had a knack of understanding people and paid respect to people that the class system here doesn't seem to have allowed at the time. And I don't think it allows it too much these days too, generally speaking. And class we won't go into
Got
that.
a whole new workshop
Yeah.
for the future on something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, what I'm going to do now is thank both of you very much, and also the audience for participating in this fascinating discussion. And thank you, and Keith, thank you very much. I mean, we didn't cover half of your note.
Yeah.
Not even, well, you know, people, you've done a lot of work, I know, for us, and there are other events, by the way. There are the Victorian Military Society is represented here and other bodies, and, you know, if you're interested, there will be other events which will point out to you where you can learn more or meet more people. And I know that Susan probably wants to wrap up here, and then we can have a drink and go our various ways.
Well, let's wrap up by thanking you, Charles, for taking this on and organising this, and obviously Anne and Keith for sharing so much information. I've learned so much. I'm sure we all have. I mean, for me, despite a very long association with the Kitchener Scholars, Kitchener was the poster, and his greatest achievement was the recruitment. But actually, now I know so much about everything else. So, thank you so much. Utterly fascinating. So much to digest. Thank you.